You're listening to Law, Life, and Culture with Betsy Kim on WNHH LP 103.5 FM, your home for community radio.
Thank you, Harry Droz and Paul Bass. I'm Betsy Kim, and welcome to Law, Life, and Culture. Today, we're here with UCLA Law School professor Joseph Fishkin, the author of this book, The Anti-Oligarchy Constitution, Reconstructing the Economic Foundations of American Democracy. It was co-authored by William Forbath, a professor at the University of Texas Austin Law School, and the New Republic calls this book rousing and authoritative. James Pope of the Washington Pope describes it as eminently readable, stating, "Anybody who cares about the future of American democracy in these perilous times can only hope that it will be widely read and carefully considered." Although now in LA, Professor Fishkin has some serious New Haven roots, including a 203 area code on his mobile phone. Professor Fishkin received his BA in Ethics, Politics, and Economics, summa cum laude, from Yale University, his JD from Yale Law School, and his DPhil in Politics at Oxford, where he was a Fulbright scholar. He clerked for the Chief Justice Margaret H. Marshall of the Supreme Court of Massachusetts, and he served as a visiting professor at Yale Law School. Thank you for joining us, Professor Fishkin.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks.
Well, from the time of Harvard University's Press's original publication of your book, has an oligarchic threat to democracy become even more severe? And if so, why? What has happened?
Yeah, look, it's certainly become more obvious. I mean, an interesting thing happened after we published this book a couple years ago, which is at the time that we published it, I would give talks and do events, and sometimes people would say, "Yeah, I see the problems you're talking about of concentrated wealth and power, but oligarchy. I mean, who are the oligarchs? Like, what are we even talking about?" And nobody asks me that anymore. I haven't gotten that question since, about January. And so, yes, I do think it's become more obvious. And just that photo from the inauguration of, all of those tech billionaires kind of lining up in front of Trump, trying to please this leader who's himself a billionaire with a cabinet full of billionaires. It's made it all more apparent, I think.
Well, relevant to Professor Fishkin's book, as a recap, there was Elon Musk's donating $250 million to back Donald Trump in the 2024 elections, then Musk's Doge involvement in government, and tech companies Amazon, Google, Meta, Microsoft, Nvidia, and Uber, each donating $1 million to Trump's inauguration fund, with CEOs such as OpenAI's Sam Altman, Apple's Tim Cook, and Uber's Dara Khosrowshahi's contributing another 1 million each. So clearly, we're in the second Gilded Age. But what seems even more alarming is how much oligarchs today also directly control public communications, the dissemination of public information with the internet, platforms like Twitter, and search engines. And this has implications for a functioning informed democracy. Professor Fishkin, how does the Anti-Oligarchy Constitution contend with this added element, including the disinformation with today and tomorrow's technology?
Yeah, look, this is not the first time that there have been concentrations of wealth and power where the really powerful people controlled important media sources. That's happened before. In fact, some of our, a century ago in the first Gilded Age, some of the major newspapers and forms of communication of that day were linked with political parties and with oligarchs who ran things in their states and places. But I do think, it's always the same and different. And the platform monopolies of today are just more sophisticated in their ability to manipulate politics than were the newspapers of a century ago. So, oligarchy at its heart is about economic and political power translating into each other. So people who are rich being able to get political power, and people who are politically powerful able to get wealth from that, the way you see in the current administration. And, that is much easier to do if in a democracy where the voters do matter. It's much easier to do if you have the means to manipulate public opinion, to manipulate the voters. And that is a huge problem. And so, I'm very happy to be here doing an interview on an independent community radio station. There's a lot of sources of information today that are not part of these centralized platform monopolies controlled by oligarchs, but there's a lot that are.
Can you share why you wrote this book?
Yeah, so we wrote this book. We started working on this book an embarrassingly large amount of years ago, well before Trump's first term began, and it really was because of the first thing you said, that we seem to be in a second Gilded Age. We could see, and many scholars could see that in terms of income and especially wealth. We are in a place of extreme inequality in the United States today, also rising in many other countries in the world, that makes things look a lot like they did at the turn of the 20th century, more than a century ago, the first Gilded Age, with these incredibly concentrated fortunes that make it difficult to have democracy. And yet, what we thought was we thought people don't necessarily appreciate that this problem, this is not a new problem, obviously, and it's a problem that previous generations of Americans saw through a constitutional lens, which today nobody looks at this problem as a constitutional problem, because when you think constitution, you think, oh, this is like litigation in court, and we can talk more about that. But we thought it would be useful today, as we're in a second Gilded Age, to tell people something about the arguments that Americans used to get out of the first one, which were constitutional arguments to a great extent. And so we thought we'd write a short article, and we would sort of, show people that these arguments used to be there and how they, and then by the time we realized how much we were grabbing hold of, there just was so much material that we ended up writing this quite long book, much of which is there kind of to show you as a reader what these arguments sounded like, what it is that Americans said during the Civil War period, during Reconstruction, during this Gilded Age, especially, when they were saying, wait a minute, these concentrations of wealth and power are a threat to our republic, are a threat to our constitutional democracy. And so that's what we wanted to recover with the book.
Now, backtracking a little bit, online, Merriam-Webster's definition of oligarchy is a government in which a small group exercises control, especially for corrupt and selfish purposes. How do you define the term oligarchy?
Yeah, I mean, that definition is not bad. I think of oligarchy as uh, when wealth and political power, or a better way to say it is when economic power and political power are concentrated in too few hands. In a democracy, you're supposed to have a wide distribution of both wealth and political power. And oligarchy is a word that captures when it's not going that way, when instead things are being concentrated among too few people. Now, in the United States, we are not in any danger of like six people running everything, It's a little bit different than that. We have a whole class of billionaires who have too much influence over our politics, and there's a lot of them. But it's also true that we have now a government whose cabinet is full of a smaller number of billionaires who have extremely disproportionate political power, and that singular individuals like Elon Musk can sometimes hold so much power that Americans can see, wait a minute, it's obvious that there's something not democratic about this. And so that's what I see as the problem of oligarchy in our context.
Your book also refers to a constitutional political economy. Will you define what that means and its role in making a democracy of opportunity?
Yeah, so political economy is one of those phrases that 100 years ago everybody just used as normal talk. This wasn't today it sounds a little weird, although it's coming back, interestingly, not just because of our book. I mean, a lot of people are bringing this phrase back. What political economy captures is that politics and economics are interconnected, and that you're not really going to understand one without understanding the other. This was understood 100 years ago by everyone before we really separated out what became economics from what we now call political science or sociology or all these other things. It was all one topic. It was like who has the wealth, who gets the power, how are each of those things distributed in society? What should the role be for labor and capital? What about, interest rates, tariffs, all of these questions. Today, many of them we view as economic questions. Back in the 19th century, Americans viewed them all as questions of political economy, and they viewed them as constitutional questions. So when we use the phrase constitutional political economy, which is a mouthful and is just our modern phrase, what we're talking about is the arguments about political economy that people used to have, the arguments about tariffs, just to pick something in the current news, or about what wages should be, arguments about whether people should have rights to organize as labor organizers at their workplace, all of these kinds of questions, antitrust, these are questions that used to be viewed as constitutional questions. Americans made constitutional arguments about them, about monetary policy, which today is the most kind of elite. You have to be a PhD economist working at the Fed to decide this policy kind of thing. In the 19th century and into the early 20th, this was at the center of American politics. Should we have gold, silver? How should we do our monetary policy? And all the sides, they disagreed about everything, but they all made constitutional arguments. And many of them made constitutional arguments that resonate with this set of ideas that we're tracing through the book, that what we're calling a tradition of arguing that we need a democracy of opportunity in this country. We need economic and political opportunity to be widely distributed. That's what a democracy of it looks like. This phrase comes from FDR. And the idea of a democracy of opportunity is that rather than being concentrated in just a few hands, economic and political opportunity is distributed widely to everyone. And we can get more into, what that means. But what I want to point out to everyone, here is the idea that the Constitution speaks to that. May seem very odd today because you might say, well, what clause of the Constitution? And actually, there were a whole bunch of clauses relevant, but it also was just a more general sort of argument than the kind of constitutional arguments we make today aimed at courts, because it was a set of constitutional arguments aimed at politics. People were making these arguments in campaigns. People were making arguments on the Senate floor, and the House floor, and in state legislators, and governors were making these arguments. Politicians were trying to argue, here's how we build a democracy. We bring the railroads to heel so that farmers can bring their goods to market, or we allow workers to organize. This was a big part of FDR's push for a democracy of opportunity. Or we, maybe most arrestingly to me, was to read all the talk about oligarchy at the time of Reconstruction, where the Reconstruction Republicans said, if we want to build a republic in the South, this land of oligarchs who control big plantations and had enslaved all of these people there, we have to do more than just tell the formerly enslaved people, now you're free. We have to distribute land to them, 40 acres and a mule. We have to somehow change the entire political economy of the South from an oligarchy into a democracy. And that was the central thread of the more radical versions of Reconstruction, some of which came to pass and some of which didn't. But for my purposes in the book, I think what's so interesting about them is that clearly those radical Republicans who thought that what they had to do in the name of the Constitution, um, clearly they were right. They saw and they were right that if you didn't break up the giant fortunes of the South, what you would end up with eventually was an oligarchy, and that is largely what happened.
I took from your book that there are three pillars critical for a democracy of opportunity, some of which you touched on, but I'm going to ask you to delve into it a little more. And one was anti-oligarchy governance, two was a strong middle class, and three was inclusion into the middle class and opportunities across race, gender, religion, and other historically excluded or exploited groups. Can you explain more these three pillars and what the strongest constitutional backing supports in them?
Yes. So these ideas are ones that we trace in the book through actually, all of American history. From the very beginning of the Republic, even at the time of the Revolution and before, you had people like Thomas Jefferson making arguments that if we were going to try to build a republic, we would need certain kinds of institutions to prevent concentrations of wealth and power. That's the first pillar, this anti-oligarchy idea, and also to create eventually a broad middle class. Now, at the beginning, this sounded different than it does today. The anti-oligarchy, I mean, a lot of it was about breaking up land. So Thomas Jefferson said you can't invent enough devices to break up large estates. And they came up with all of these things that, unlike the laws of England, the land was not going to pass to the firstborn son. We're going to break it up among all of the children in each generation. And eventually, what you would have, Jefferson and others hoped, was a bunch of small landholders who had enough economic independence that they could be good political citizens in a democracy. That's the broad middle class in a kind of agrarian world. Now, of course, this was only for white people. It had many problems. It was only for men. It was, the people who were arguing this were themselves enslaving people. In a lot of ways, it didn't make sense. But they had this sense of, if we want a democracy at all, even a democracy among white men, we're going to have the political economy work a certain way. We're going to have to break up the big fortunes. And we're going to have to give everyone a kind of economic basis on which they can be independent. So those early ideas, which get threaded through the Jacksonian Revolution and constitutional arguments throughout the 19th century, where they really kind of come to a head is in the moment I was mentioning earlier of Reconstruction, where you had this sense um, among Reconstruction Republicans who were enacting what would become the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, that what they really needed to do to secure the future of a republic across the United States, including in the South, was these three things: to block oligarchy. And so those Republicans would begin what we now think of as antitrust law. In addition to breaking up large estates, they would break up large companies. They saw that you needed a broad middle class, and they believed that by opening up land to the West and by creating a world of lots of small landholders, you could achieve this. And they saw that it wasn't going to work, that these first two principles of anti-oligarchy and a broad middle class were going to fall apart if you didn't have racial inclusion. Now, they did not all see gender inclusion. That would come later. Some of them saw it as essential, but the core idea that if you try to create a democracy, as one of the Reconstruction Republicans put it, in a land of nabobs and serfs, it just wasn't going to hold. It wasn't going to work. If you had a whole class who was the formerly enslaved people who were excluded from the middle class, then they would not be able to sustain a democracy for long. And so you needed to have all three of these things working together. And that insight, which was so important, kind of brought together these three threads of what became an American tradition of constitutional argument that stretches forward as well, all the way through the middle 20th century, when I think, for reasons we can talk about, it starts to disappear as our understanding of what a constitutional argument sounds like changes. It becomes more court-centered, how it is today. But anyway, throughout our history, especially from Reconstruction through World War II, there have been many people making different claims on these three principles. And their meaning changes, like once you have industrialization, you have to start to say, well, wait, maybe the problem isn't land being held by too few people. The problem is we have these robber barons who are controlling all of our jobs and are, running the government in states like Montana, where extractive industries based on a few New York robber barons were literally, running their entire political scene. That looks like oligarchy, and so we have to figure out a new way to stop that. And those are the kind of arguments that people made in this tradition.
And what I truly appreciated about this book was how it made me rethink unhelpful notions I harbored and better understand where they came from and correct certain wrong assumptions. For example, your book clarifies how the Constitution is a strong friend of liberals and progressives, and this is a far better approach to be backed by the Constitution. And your book traces how conservative Republicans and ideological descendants of Dixiecrats succeeded in welding their interpretation of a constitution as key to this national American character or identity or psyche of rugged individualism and limited government. How was this so successful in this version becoming capturing the American imagination, which does not benefit the majority of people living under the Constitution?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I mean, we could spend hours on this question of just how did sort of right wing and economically libertarian ideas capture our sense of what the Constitution is so effectively. I mean, I think the truth is it's very difficult for any side to say the Constitution is only on my side and not on your side. Um, and I don't claim that in this book. What I'm interested in doing is not saying, look, I've shown that Americans have always argued for an anti-oligarchy constitution, and therefore that is the right and only correct meaning. And therefore, here's how that should resolve controversies today that no one could have ever imagined when they were writing the Constitution. That's not really what I'm trying to do. But I do think that because there are other people doing that thing, because there are so many arguments that sound like that sound like I have found this document from, or this set of uses of words from the 18th century, and therefore, free speech includes unlimited campaign contributions or, unlimited campaign spending, this kind of stuff. That because that kind of argument is out there today and it trades on the authority of the Constitution, I think it's worth people knowing that for most of our history, that is not how constitutional argument worked, and the Constitution was as or more often deployed on behalf of the side of these debates that wanted to restrain oligarchy. And for most of our history, just to take, I just was alluding to, Citizens United and other campaign finance decisions that have interpreted the First Amendment to say we need a political system in which oligarchs can spend as much money as they want and, group themselves together and all this kind of thing. Um, that's one view, but for most of our history, Americans have used the Constitution to argue just the opposite way, to argue for the necessity of restrictions on the power of wealthy people to intervene in and control elections and to spend money that way. In fact, one of the stories we tell in the book, I was alluding to Montana earlier, and there's a period of Montana history, and actually in the history of much of the West, where you really saw the way I guess you see glimmers today. You really saw oligarchy in sort of its raw form, a small number of people buying off or controlling out of fear entire state legislatures. And the people, in kind of taking power back into their own hands in Montana and in several Western states through new tools like ballot initiatives, they believed that what they were doing by taking power back and restraining the power of oligarchs was constitutionally necessary. And they said so. Constitutionally necessary in order to preserve the republic that our federal constitution and maybe also their state constitutions contemplate and intend to lay out. So, it's not that I think the Constitution is sort of 100% the progressive's friend, and in every case, if we were true originalists, we would be progressive. There are a lot of areas where that is true, and certainly the way this current Supreme Court is eviscerating the Voting Rights Act would have been very surprising and appalling to the people who enacted the Reconstruction Amendments, where they were trying to put in more or less exactly the stuff the court is now eviscerating. But, there are also a lot of areas where where the relationship between the policy questions and the Constitution is more complicated, and where you can come out different ways. What I'm trying to do with the book is give people the information and the arguments that they can use to show that a lot of things that you might think are just on the one side, it's progressives with good policy arguments, and on the other side, the conservatives have a real constitutional claim. No, no, the progressive side of many of these arguments has just as rich a tradition of constitutional claims, often richer and often deeper, going back further. Some of these libertarian ideas are of quite recent vintage. Antitrust rolled along for many decades before anybody had the modern idea that it was just trying to, protect consumers and actually big is good. For most of American history, it was pretty clear to most lawmakers that if you had an industry and instead of a lot of small players, everything was going to get rolled up into one giant monopoly, that was bad, not just for consumers, but for democracy, because that monopoly would have political power, and that's the part that I think we have often lost sight of. That I'm hoping that this book can do, a part of helping us see again.
You're listening to Professor Joseph Fishkin, author of The Anti-Oligarchy Constitution, and I'm Betsy Kim on Law, Life, and Culture on WNHH 103.5 FM in New Haven, Connecticut. So, Professor Fishkin, you note there is a problem in casting the Constitution outside of politics. And I appreciated what many people, including myself, would not necessarily think, how courts historically have often worked to protect the property and rights of ruling elites. The book notes that from today's Supreme Court, justices are not necessarily these impartial referees of the law, and especially on the right, have become partisan advocates, and the referees need to be the American people. Can you explain more what you mean by this and the role the American people need to take?
Yeah, so, we have had situations before in American history where the Supreme Court became a highly politically contested partisan uh, body. And it wasn't always um, exactly like today, where one party was on one side and one party was on the other side. 100 years ago, or 100 to 150 years ago, when the Supreme Court was often on the side of wealthy people and the politically powerful, the Supreme Court was often composed of lawyers who had formerly represented like the railroads and the trusts and the great monopolies of the age. And so I think a good example of what that looked like might be um, when the Supreme Court decided to strike down the income tax as unconstitutional, which they did. There had been an income tax during the Civil War. Then after it, there was the first peacetime income tax. The Supreme Court said, no, we strike this down. It violates equal protection because it treats, wealthy people who earn enough to pay a lot of tax differently and unfairly compared to poorer people who don't have to pay any income tax under that tax. And, you know, the American people, overturned that decision of the Supreme Court by constitutional amendment. And that was an important example of, and it took years of political organizing and fighting to get there, of politics against a hostile Supreme Court. FDR famously ran against the Supreme Court, the 9 old men who were blocking the New Deal that would help economically immiserated Americans dig out of the Depression. We have had before, many actually, moments in our politics where we've had political fights against the Supreme Court. My interest in this topic comes from the fact that we are living in a funny moment where, because of the last sort of 60 or 70 years, because of the Warren Court that decided Brown v. Board and Miranda and many liberal rulings, Roe v. Wade, the liberal side of the political spectrum has generally been, ever since, defensive of the court. The liberals of America have said, don't do politics against the court, protect the court, don't do the kind of aggressive steps like take the jurisdiction away from the court, because we want the Supreme Court to be the guardian of, constitutional ideals like the ones embodied in the Warren Court decisions. The problem with this way of thinking is that the Warren Court turns out to have been a blip. Most of American history, instead, more of the time than not, the Supreme Court is on the side of wealthy and powerful people most of the time. Now, that doesn't mean the Supreme Court can't do any important good things, and doesn't mean we shouldn't have a Supreme Court or it shouldn't have lots of power, but we do need a kind of escape valve somewhere of people being able to say through politics, through their politicians, we don't accept the Supreme Court's interpretation, and we think it needs to change. The right has done lots of that, especially with regard to abortion, and have finally succeeded in their quest over many decades to get Roe overturned. They did this by doing the thing that I think all sides in politics sometimes need to do, which is have a politics against the Supreme Court. Have a politics about the fact that sometimes the court does things that you think are wrong. And this is something that I think is uncomfortable for liberals, because, it's like, well, then what? Are we just saying whatever politicians say should control the court? Not exactly, I think. What the court does is different from what politicians do. The courts have to use legal materials. But what the court does is not totally outside of politics either. And so that's why I think this famous metaphor that you brought up, Betsy, of the umpire, or the referee, in politics, John Roberts famously at his confirmation hearing talked about it, about how I'm just an umpire calling balls and strikes. This is not true. This metaphor is a way of insulating the court from politics. And the better way to understand it, I think, is that the Supreme Court is a specialized venue where a very unusual and rarefied kind of politics is happening. And if we don't like it, if we don't like what the court is doing, and the court is giving Americans a lot of things not to like lately, then we need to be open to a politics of opposing the court. And that's what I think is, it's still pretty much missing, but it's starting to emerge from some politicians and some activists and speakers who are beginning to say, we actually need to have a political party that is running against this court and what it's doing. And I think that's what it will take to eventually turn around this court.
Your book also points out how we've come to accept a boundary between politics and economics, with the most important economic questions left to experts, informed by economic science and insulated from politics. And I think personally, this partly stems from a fear of exaggerated comparisons to communist dictatorships that run the economy. But Obamacare was to bolster the middle class by providing financial security and net for the healthcare costs, which can easily bankrupt people lacking health insurance. Now, with Obamacare, this was a battle against social insurance using the Commerce Clause and federalism, yet we have a history of creating laws resulting in, for example, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, that most people would agree are quite essential for society. How do we not surrender the Constitution to corporate messaging that ultimately harms the majority of people in our society economically?
Yeah, you're bringing up a whole interesting set of examples there because, I think what examples like Social Security and Medicare illustrate is that some of the times we make a political choice to change the way our economy is structured. That's what both of those things were. Major forms of social insurance that change the way things are set up economically and that ultimately get their own political momentum that helps sustain them through politics. Very interesting to me to watch as with some horror as our Congress cuts Medicaid, but they still won't touch Medicare because it is that much politically stronger with that many people who vote a lot because they're over 65. So I think um, all one thing that those programs all have in common, and this may be what you're alluding to in your question, is they all face constitutional objections that, including some in court, but also some in Congress and elsewhere, that you can't possibly do this. The federal government shouldn't have the power to do this. And famously, Obamacare itself has been the subject of many recent court challenges, including one that severely kneecapped the way the law was originally supposed to work by allowing states to opt out of the Medicaid expansion. In any event, the objections to these laws constitutionally always have this character of we think the government shouldn't have the power to provide these forms of social insurance. But if you look deeper into kind of American constitutional history, we have always provided forms of social insurance through the federal government using the powers to spend money. For example, disaster relief. I mean, we have this ridiculous notion today of returning FEMA to the states. You can't do that because the states never had it. There was never a way to deal with national disasters through state rather than federal government because it's the federal government that's big enough and has the resources. Even in the early Republic years, even in the 19th century, it was the federal government that did disaster relief. And when people were arguing in Congress about, I don't think we should spend money to send money to your state where you had a flood, and the argument came back, well, we spent money in your state when you had a flood. So I think the constitutional precedent is that we do this. And you had constitutional arguments there. I mean, admittedly in Congress rather than in courts, but you had constitutional arguments that this is actually something that the federal government was obligated to do. And I think today, when we have ongoing fights about the scope of social insurance, it's mostly policy and politics arguments, but there is room, I think, for constitutional arguments on both sides, and I think our discussions would be enriched by having more of a sense of the constitutional arguments for social insurance that have been made at many points in our history.
Your book also discusses the phenomenon of weaponizing the First Amendment, particularly in campaign finance and labor laws. Can you explain how what originally was supposed to be protection of people with unpopular ideas was convoluted to serve the most powerful entities against individuals with so much less power?
Yeah, it's a strange and I agree, kind of a sad story. We have a current First Amendment jurisprudence that actually both on the religion side, which is not what you were as focused on in your question, but there too, and as on the speech side, the court has taken a body of law that used to protect, as you say, dissenters, like weird people with speech that is unpopular. And instead, today, so much of the jurisprudence is things like, oh, we're going to destroy public sector unions by holding that, you have a First Amendment right against having your money used by the union if you don't like what the union is saying, or something like that. And there's a whole range of moves that the court has done. I mean, I earlier spoke about the campaign finance moves. Those were on the basis of the First Amendment, where the court is saying, oh, we think basically the right of, someone like, picture Elon Musk, to spend unlimited amounts of money in politics, more or less, loosely separated, not coordinated with the politicians that he's giving all the money on behalf of. We think that's protected by the First Amendment. These ideas were not the ideas that animated the people who put the First Amendment into the Constitution, and they were not the ideas that animated the Americans in the courts and outside them in the ACLU in the early 20th century, when the First Amendment first became a kind of actually litigated part of the Constitution. For most of the first, century of our plus of our time, the First Amendment was, not really doing any work in courts. Once we started using it, it was there to protect outliers and dissenters. And it's the same with the protections for freedom of religion. For a good part of our history, the First Amendment there was a protection. I mean, especially in the kind of Warren Court era, it was to protect people whose religions others thought were strange and didn't like them. And that is consistent with what the purpose of protecting freedom of religion in the Constitution was. But today, instead, we have a court that, especially certain justices like Justice Samuel Alito, are very sympathetic to the poor, beleaguered conservative Christian majority in this country. And that's the group whose freedom of religion claims he gives a special extra respect to. And so you end up with freedom of religion claims that are basically for the majority to, um, you know, uh, take resources and otherwise bully others, groups that already have lots of political power. So I think this is a major problem. A lot of legal scholars who are more focused on the First Amendment than I have written many articles at this point about the weaponization of the First Amendment, a phrase that Justice Kagan used in one of her dissents to describe this phenomenon. But it's really true. I mean, the First Amendment can reach very far. And certainly when we're already talking about things as far afield from speech as like campaign finance, um, I think it's illustrative of how this is being sort of repurposed. This amendment is being repurposed as a sort of, um, all-purpose multi-tool of economic libertarian thought at the court.
Now, another thought, an idea that I learned from your book, which you discussed a little earlier in the conversation, was how Robert Bork and the Chicago School shifted the focus of U.S. antitrust law from preventing the concentration of economic power to consumer welfare, meaning antitrust laws now enjoin mergers, which cause higher consumer prices, with the focus being less on companies gaining too much economic, thereby political power. Can you further explain how antitrust laws reduce oligarchies and what people can do to further or support stronger antitrust laws?
Yeah. So it's very interesting. this was one of the areas that I learned a lot about in order to write the book. I wasn't someone who, had been an antitrust scholar before. And it turns out that the people who put our antitrust laws in place in the late 19th century had a really specific idea. And interestingly, it was an idea that the courts did not like. And that's why they had to keep enacting more antitrust laws. The courts kept interpreting them in ways that watered them down. And the people in Congress kept saying, no, we really care about not having too much economic power in the hands of too few firms because they're going to squeeze everybody. They're going to do exactly what Amazon does now. They're going to squeeze their suppliers. They're going to make it hard for the independent businesses who are stuck using them. At the time, it was mostly railroads. If you were a farmer and the only way to get your stuff to market was to use the one railroad that went near you, you were completely beholden to them. Whatever they made you pay, you would have to pay. And so the original idea of antitrust law in the 19th century was not about improving consumer prices. It was about the fact that all the other economic actors, all the entrepreneurs, all the small businesses, all of the individuals who are going to have to interact in both directions with these monopolies, um, you need to break it up. You can't have too much power in too few hands. And so, this idea was revived in a powerful way by Lena Khan, the head of the Federal Trade Commission during the Biden years. And I think we are now seeing that progress reversed. It was very striking to me just like a couple weeks ago when it was announced that for the first time, there would be a transcontinental railroad in the United States because Union Pacific is planning to buy Norfolk Southern so that you can get on one train, one company can bring your goods from Los Angeles to, I guess, Virginia. And, that dream of a national railroad, obviously Jay Gould and the other oligarchs of the rail baron era, they thought of that. They wanted that. What stopped them from gaining that kind of power was antitrust law and the Americans who enacted state and federal, especially federal antitrust law to stop those kinds of combinations because of the damage they would do, not just to consumers, but to producers. The fact that um, when we try to have a business, we need there to be competition at each level. And there's been some terrific work by people like David Diane, and by journalists as well as scholars to try to show people what it means today that in so many industries, the producers, like the farmers who farm chickens, they used to be able to sell to a lot of different buyers, but now it's only a couple. And that makes things much worse for them, much harder for them. And so there's a way in which a lot of the story of economic inequality of our time, I mean, there's a debate about how much, but certainly a lot, is a story of economic concentration of power of a kind that Americans used to say violated our Constitution, violated our sense of how you build a republic where we need a certain amount of broad distribution of economic and political power. So that's the story of antitrust that I think is worth recovering. More recently, as you mentioned, Robert Bork, then Yale law professor, conservative intellectual, and sort of failed Supreme Court nominee, had this other vision. This often is called the Chicago School vision because many of law professors at Chicago were arguing for it, which says, well, actually, when we think about the economics of monopoly, sometimes it seems good. There's economies of scale, big can be more efficient. And so, therefore, what we should do is we should analyze antitrust questions in terms of how are they going to ultimately affect prices. And so, if Amazon can offer the lowest prices because it's so big, um, then we're not too worried about the fact that all of the people who are trying to sell their stuff on there have to pay, half of their revenue to Amazon or whatever crazy number in order to sell because we're just focused on whether the goods end up cheap at the end of the day. And I don't get me wrong, cheap goods are not nothing. That's a real value, but it's not the value that antitrust law was originally supposed to be about. And I think it would be very helpful to bring antitrust more back to its roots.
This brings me to another point in your book, the idea that constitutional arguments take place both inside and outside the courts at the same time. You put it crossing membranes, separating the two. And Justice Ketanji Jackson Brown has received attention and harsh criticism for her vocal dissents. After reading your book, I appreciated more the reasons and importance behind her dissents. But what impacts do you see from her dissents, and could they have or have they affected legislation?
Yeah, look, we'll see. I mean, there are certainly examples from history and from pretty recent history of dissents translating into lawmaking. I mean, I could think just in recent years of Justice Ginsburg writing that Lilly Ledbetter, an employment discrimination victim, who the court held was not allowed to sue because she didn't sue soon enough, even though she couldn't have known that she was being discriminated against. Justice Ginsburg basically turned her dissent into a letter to Congress saying, you guys need to fix this. And they actually did. Now, we don't currently have a Congress that is particularly in tune with Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's views, but I think she is making a decision as, you know, the newest member of the court to write for the future. And it's not dissimilar, I think, from what Justice Clarence Thomas chose to do in his jurisprudence when he joined the court in the late 80s, which is early 90s, which was to say, I'm going to write a bunch of dissents that nobody is necessarily going to buy right now, but I am going to lay out a vision of how the Constitution could be different that could matter in the future. And so I very much appreciate what she's doing. She's clearly making a different tactical choice than some of the other democratically appointed justices who are trying to, work more closely with the majority and come up with what compromises they can. She's writing more for the future and for the public and for politics. And that's important to do because, we have this weird situation where we have overly elevated the role of the Supreme Court in constitutional interpretation. We have decided as a society, especially liberals, to be very deferential to the court. And so I think it helps to hear from inside the court that things are going wrong. I think that can be helpful in building a politics that would more explicitly aim to set things right.
Is it too defeatist to ever feel politics has long been dependent on oligarchical sources? You need a tremendous amount of capital, either financial or charismatic, to gather the financial capital. Does it ever become reality to just hope or the best, smartest, most ethical, most well-intended oligarchical candidate wins? In the tradition, perhaps, of the Kennedys, Michael Bloomberg,
Right.
J.B. Pritzker.
Yeah, right. I mean, obviously, if we end up with a Pritzker running for president, it will put a fine point on your question. Look, I mean, I don't think that anybody has a monopoly on who needs to run for office. I mean, the interesting thing about the weird attention economy of our political time is that, as you were sort of suggesting with your reference to charisma, anybody who has a lot of charisma can possibly amass around themselves the kind of support and the kind of donations that one could use to run for office. And so I don't necessarily think we are stuck with, billionaire candidates out to the horizon. I think there's a lot of potential for candidates who basically figure out how to use the current very difficult media environment to their advantage to to find a way through. And I think, one of the things when I was writing this book, it was before and then it was during the 2016 presidential campaign. We saw Bernie Sanders running in a way that I think, I mean, he was using the word oligarchy a lot, so I appreciated that, but it was more the substance. He captured quite a few of these older constitutional ideas in his campaign, and I think that can be done again. I don't think you have to be a billionaire to run for office in America at the moment. But I also I take your point that sometimes it's going to be a contest among different economically powerful factions. My hope is that enough Americans over time will come to dislike that enough that they will choose maybe charismatic outsiders.
WNHHLP 103.5 FM, New Haven.
I'm sorry that this hour has just flown by and we're
It's
out.
true.
So
This has
thank
been
you
great.
very much for joining us, Professor Joseph Fishkin, author of the Anti-Oligarchy Constitution on WNHH. I'm Betsy Kim.
Thank you.